Dust isn't just dirt, it is the pulverized remains of a bankrupt legacy. When the loan appraiser drove his silver sedan onto the Thornton family farm, the topsoil blew across his windshield like dry, suffocating ash. Abigail watched him from the porch, her hands calloused and her pockets completely empty, knowing the county had already dug her financial grave. The neighboring mega-farmers were placing bets at the local diner on which week she'd finally fold. But beneath the cracked, barren earth of her inheritance, a microscopic war was about to begin. A desperate gamble involving millions of tiny green seeds was about to turn 80 years of ruthless agricultural dogma completely upside down. The July sun beat down on Oak Haven Valley like a hammer on an anvil. In this part of the country, a farmer's worth was measured by the height of their corn and the deep chemical green of their fields. For Abigail Thornton, the color of her inheritance was a pale, sickly yellow, fading rapidly into the brittle brown of a dying dream. Abigail knelt in the middle of her south 40 acres, driving her bare hands into the dirt. It didn't yield. The soil was as hard as concrete, a crust of baked clay that cracked in jagged, geometric lines. When she finally managed to pry a chunk loose, it crumbled into fine dust that the hot wind immediately snatched away. There was no moisture, no structure, and certainly no life. No earthworms wriggled from the clods, no intricate white threads of fungal mycelium held the dirt together. It was dead dirt, addicted to synthetic inputs, and now suffering from absolute withdrawal. "You're not going to squeeze water from a stone, Abby? And you sure as hell aren't going to grow 80 bushel beans in that powder." Abigail didn't have to look up to recognize the heavy, booming voice. Harlan Mitchell stood at the edge of the field, his boots resting casually on the bottom wire of the rusted fence separating their properties. Harlan owned 5,000 acres to Abigail's 500. His fields, directly adjacent to hers, were impeccably uniform, weed-free, and pumped so full of anhydrous ammonia and synthetic phosphates that you could practically smell the sterile chemical bite in the air. Abigail stood, dusting off her jeans, her jaw setting into a tight line. "It's just a dry spell, Harlan. The subsoil moisture is still there. We just need one good front to push through." Harlan chuckled, a condescending sound that vibrated deep in his barrel chest. He adjusted his pristine, branded seed cap. "Subsoil moisture. Abby, your dad, God rest his soul, ran this ground into the bedrock. Thomas was a good man, but he farmed like it was still 1990. He didn't adapt, and now you're looking at the consequences. First Horizon Bank isn't going to accept subsoil moisture as a collateral payment." He wasn't wrong, and that was the knife twisting in her gut. Her father, Thomas Thornton, had spent the last decade of his life chasing diminishing returns. As the soil degraded, it required more synthetic fertilizer just to maintain average yields. When the weeds became resistant to the usual herbicides, he had to buy stronger, more expensive chemicals. It was a vicious, escalating treadmill of debt, and when Thomas suffered a fatal heart attack on his tractor 6 months ago, Abigail inherited not a thriving agricultural enterprise, but a $500,000 anvil of debt. "I can handle the bank," Abigail lied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Sure you can," Harlan said smoothly, his eyes calculating. "But you don't have to. I made you a fair offer for this parcel last week, $2,000 an acre. It's more than the bank will give you at auction, and it lets you walk away with enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere easier. This land has been in the Thornton family for 4 generations, Harlan. It's not for sale." Harlan's smile faded, replaced by a cold, businesslike hard line. "Pride doesn't pay the diesel bill, little girl. You haven't pre-ordered your autumn nitrogen spray. You haven't booked your fungicide. If you don't put chemicals on this dead dirt, you won't grow weeds, let alone a cash crop. When Clayton Price comes knocking, don't say I didn't throw you a lifeline." Harlan turned and lumbered back to his idling, $500,000 air-conditioned tractor, leaving Abigail alone in the swirling dust. She walked back to the sprawling, weather-beaten farmhouse, the oppressive heat mirroring the suffocation in her chest. Sitting at the kitchen table, she opened her battered leather ledger. The numbers were absolute, unforgiving facts. The cost of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer had skyrocketed by 40% due to global supply chain issues. Herbicide costs were up 25%. If she followed the conventional wisdom, the exact methods Harlan used, the exact methods that had bankrupted her father. She would need $150,000 just to get the seed in the ground and keep it alive. She had $12,000 left in her operating account. A sharp knock at the screen door startled her. Through the mesh, the silhouette of a tall, painfully thin man in a sharp grey suit loomed. It was Clayton Price, the loan officer from First Horizon Bank. Clayton was a man who looked upon farms not as living ecosystems but as line items on a spreadsheet. "Abigail," Clayton said, letting himself in without waiting for an invitation. He placed a thick manila folder on her kitchen table. "I wanted to deliver this personally, out of respect for your late father." "A notice of default?" Abigail asked, staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "A final warning," Clayton corrected, tapping the folder with a manicured fingernail. "Your operating loan is officially categorized as high risk. We've seen your soil test results from the county extension office. Your organic matter is below 1%. The nitrogen levels are non-existent. You have no pre-purchase orders for fertilizer on record with any local co-op. How exactly do you plan to grow a crop to pay us back?" "I'm pivoting," Abigail said, the words tumbling out before she had fully formulated the thought. "I'm changing the management strategy." Clayton raised an eyebrow. "Unless your strategy involves an immediate injection of capital and a massive application of synthetic inputs, the bank will not extend your timeline. You have until the end of the harvest season. If you cannot cover the balloon payment on the mortgage by November 1st, we will initiate foreclosure." He turned on his heel and walked out, the screen door slamming behind him with a sharp, final crack. Abigail stared at the ledger. If she played by their rules, she was already dead. The only way to survive was to change the game entirely. That night, sleep was a phantom. Abigail sat illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of her laptop screen. The kitchen table was buried under stacks of her father's old farming journals, university agricultural studies, and printouts from obscure corners of the internet. She had been researching for weeks, looking for a loophole in the ironclad laws of modern chemical farming. If she couldn't afford nitrogen, she had to find a way to make it. Her screen displayed a dense, academic paper written by an independent soil biologist named Dr. Harrison Mead. The paper wasn't about adding chemicals to the soil. It was about waking the soil up. Mead wrote about the forgotten intelligence of the earth, specifically the symbiotic relationship between leguminous plants, mycorrhizal fungi, and atmospheric nitrogen. "The modern farmer," Mead wrote, "is essentially a hydroponic grower using dirt merely to hold the plant up while feeding it synthetic liquid through an IV. But true soil is a living stomach. If you plant a cover crop like Trifolium repens, white Dutch clover, as a living mulch directly beneath the primary cash crop, you don't just suppress weeds. The clover partners with rhizobium bacteria to pull free nitrogen directly from the air and push it into the soil. It forms a subterranean armor." Abigail read the passage 3 times. White Dutch clover. It was considered a weed by every farmer in Oakhaven Valley. If a single patch of clover appeared in Harlan Mitchell's pristine rows, he would nuke the entire acre with herbicide just to prove a point. Planting it intentionally, right between the rows of a cash crop, was considered agricultural heresy. It would compete for water. It would harbor pests. It would be a messy, chaotic disaster. Or it would save her farm. The next morning, Abigail drove her dented pickup truck to the Oakhaven Agricultural Co-op. The air inside the massive warehouse smelled heavily of treated seed and toxic dust. Dale Garrison, the co-op manager, was leaning over the counter, chatting amiably with 3 local farmers. The conversation stopped dead the moment Abigail walked in. "Morning, Abby," Dale said, a note of cautious pity in his voice. "Sorry to hear about the bank sniffing around. What can we do for you? Finally ready to put in that order for anhydrous? I can try to float you a line of credit for a few weeks." "No, Dale," Abigail said, her voice clear and carrying through the quiet store. "I don't need any nitrogen or herbicide." The farmers exchanged sideways glances. One of them snorted. "Okay," Dale said slowly. "Then what are you looking for?" "I need white Dutch clover seed, a lot of it. I need enough to interseed 300 acres. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Clover?" Dale asked, blinking rapidly as if she had spoken to him in a foreign language. "For a pasture. You don't have cattle, Abby?" "Not for a pasture. I'm planting it between my corn rows as a living mulch." A loud, booming laugh echoed from the back aisle. Harlan Mitchell stepped out from behind a pallet of herbicide, shaking his head. "Well, boys, I think the stress has finally cracked the poor girl's mind. She's intentionally planting weeds in her corn." The other farmers chuckled, emboldened by Harlan's mockery. It's not a weed, Harlan, Abigail said, her cheeks flushing hot, but she held her ground. It fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. It shades the soil to prevent evaporation. It feeds the microbial life. It's a parasite, Abigail, Harlan snapped, stepping closer, his amusement vanishing. It's going to suck whatever trace amount of moisture is left in that dead dirt of yours and choke out your corn. And worse, it's going to go to seed and blow over onto my property. I won't stand for it. Keep your herbicides on your side of the fence, Harlan, and I'll keep my clover on mine, Abigail shot back. She turned to Dale. Do you have the seed or not? Dale hesitated, looking at Harlan, then back to Abigail. I have a pallet in the back that's been sitting there for 3 years. Nobody buys it except folks doing lawn repair. I'll give it to you at cost just to get it out of here. But Abby, you're making a mistake. You can't outsmart the chemistry. I'm not trying to outsmart it, Abigail said, pulling out her checkbook. I'm trying to replace it. The planting process was a brutal, exhausting nightmare, because modern agricultural equipment was designed exclusively for bare, sterile earth. Abigail had to spend 3 days in her barn, modifying her grandfather's rusted row planter with duct tape, scrap metal, and sheer willpower. She had to calibrate the ancient machine to drop the tiny clover seeds at the exact right depth between the rows where she had just planted her corn. For 2 weeks, she worked from before sunrise until long after sunset. Her hands bled, her back screamed in agony, and the diesel fumes from the old tractor gave her a permanent, throbbing headache. Every time she reached the end of a row near the property line, she could see Harlan or one of his farmhands watching her from the comfort of their modern cabs, shaking their heads or pointing and laughing. By the time she finished, the town was buzzing with the scandal. Abigail Thornton had lost her mind. She was committing financial suicide. The local paper even ran a thinly veiled editorial about the dangers of radical, unproven farming methods threatening the county's agricultural integrity. But Abigail didn't care about the whispers. She cared about the dirt. Now, the fate of her family's legacy rested beneath the soil, waiting in the dark. June brought a cruel, unrelenting heat wave, but July brought the apocalypse. The rain simply stopped. The weather patterns shifted, locking Oak Haven Valley under a high-pressure dome that baked the earth day after merciless day. The local news meteorologists began using words like historic, flash drought, and catastrophic. For the conventional farmers, the panic was immediate and palpable. Synthetic fertilizers are essentially salts. When you pump millions of pounds of salt into the soil, the plants require massive, continuous amounts of water just to process the chemicals without burning up. Without rain, the heavily fertilized corn on Harlan Mitchell's side of the fence began to turn a sickly, grayish-blue, the universal botanical sign of severe stress. The leaves rolled up tight like cigars, desperately trying to conserve moisture. Abigail's farm, from the road, looked like an absolute disaster. If a passerby looked at Harlan's field, they saw perfectly straight rows of struggling corn, but not a single weed in sight. It was neat, orderly, and dying. If they looked at Abigail's field, they saw pure chaos. The white Dutch clover had germinated with a vengeance, exploding into a thick, tangled, vibrant green carpet across all 300 acres. Her corn stalks were shooting up through the middle of the clover, looking messy, unkempt, and wild. To the untrained eye, Harlan had been right. Abigail was letting weeds overrun her crop. The tension in the valley reached a boiling point. The Oak Haven Agricultural Association, heavily influenced by Harlan, sent Abigail a formal warning letter, citing nuisance and negligence, and threatening a county fine for harboring uncontrolled vegetation. Clayton Price left 3 voicemails, his tone shifting from professional to openly hostile, reminding her that a failed crop meant immediate asset seizure by November. One blistering Tuesday afternoon, the temperature gauge on Abigail's porch read 104 degrees. She sat on the steps, a glass of warm water in her hands, watching the heat shimmer in waves over the road. Harlan's massive pickup truck came tearing down the dirt lane, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust before skidding to a halt near her mailbox. Harlan stomped out, his face purple with rage. "Have you seen what your damn weeds are doing?" he bellowed, pointing a thick, calloused finger at her fields. "Your corn is competing for water. It's 50 degrees out there, Abby, and you've got a blanket of green sucking the life out of the ground. You're going to lose everything, and you're dragging property values down with you. Abigail stood up slowly. The exhaustion in her bones was heavy, a physical weight she carried every second of the day. For a moment, looking at the chaotic, tangled green mass of her fields, a sharp spike of terror pierced her chest. What if Harlan was right? What if Dr. Mead's theories only worked in a laboratory? What if she had just sealed her own doom? "Let's go look, Harlan," she said quietly. "What? If you're so sure my soil is dead, come walk the field with me. Let's see what the clover is doing." Harlan scoffed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I don't need to walk into that jungle to know a failure when I see it. Are you scared of a little weed, Harlan?" she challenged, her voice cold, his eyes narrowed. "Fine, let's go look at your grave." They walked side by side out into the blazing sun, crossing the dirt track to the edge of Abigail's cornfield. The heat radiating off the bare, baked earth of the dirt road was intense enough to melt the rubber on their boots. They stepped into the field. Immediately, something felt different. Harlan stopped abruptly, looking down at his boots. He frowned, shifting his weight. Abigail felt it too. The ambient temperature around her ankles had plummeted. The thick living carpet of clover was creating a microclimate. It was catching the dew in the mornings and shielding the earth from the brutal solar radiation during the day. Abigail dropped to her knees right in the middle of a row. She pulled a heavy steel trowel from her belt. "Watch this," she said. She drove the trowel into the earth. On Harlan's side of the fence, driving a shovel into the ground required the force of a hydraulic press. The dirt was baked into a solid ceramic brick. Here, Abigail's trowel slid into the soil with a soft, yielding shook sound. Harlan stepped back, his mouth opening slightly in shock. Abigail turned over a massive clod of earth. It wasn't the pale, dusty powder of a month ago. It was dark. It was rich, smelling of deep woods and rain, even though it hadn't rained in 4 weeks. But that wasn't the twist that made Harlan's breath catch in his throat. As Abigail broke the clod apart in her hands, she didn't just reveal moisture. Clinging to the roots of the clover and the corn were thousands of tiny, bright pink nodules, and weaving through everything, binding the soil together in a spongy, water-holding matrix, was a dense, glowing white web of mycorrhizal fungi. "What did you spray?" Harlan whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the moist, dark earth in her hands. "I didn't spray anything, Harlan," Abigail said, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her sunburnt face. "I gave the soil a job, and it's doing what no fertilizer could ever do." She broke open one of the tiny pink nodules on the clover root, revealing a blood-red center. "Leghemoglobin," she whispered, remembering the textbooks. The bacteria were actively pulling nitrogen from the very air they were breathing and injecting it directly into the roots of her corn. The clover wasn't stealing water. The fungal web it had created was acting like a massive subterranean sponge, tapping into deep capillary moisture that Harlan's chemically stunted, shallow-rooted corn could never reach. Harlan stared at the rich, dark soil, then looked over his shoulder at his own massive, immaculate fields. For the first time, he noticed that the edges of his perfectly straight, chemical-fed corn were not just stressed. They were beginning to turn brown. They were dying. "It's an anomaly," Harlan muttered, backing away, his face pale beneath his tan. "It won't last. When the deep heat hits next month, that clover will dry up and take your corn with it." He turned and fast walked back to his truck, desperate to escape the undeniable proof lying in the palm of her hand. Abigail stayed on her knees in the dirt, the cool moisture seeping into her jeans. She had won the battle beneath the ground, but as she looked up at the relentless, cloudless sky, she knew the ultimate test was yet to come. The bank was still waiting, the county was still threatening, and the drought was only just beginning to show its teeth. By the second week of August, the drought had transformed from an agricultural concern into an economic catastrophe. Oakhaven Valley was suffocating under a relentless high-pressure dome that refused to break. The local reservoir dropped to historic lows, and the county issued emergency water restrictions. Out on the county roads, the dust was so thick it coated the roadside mailboxes in a permanent layer of pale, gritty powder. But the real disaster was unfolding in the fields. Harlan Mitchell's 5,000 acres, normally the pride of the county, looked like a sprawling, tragic graveyard. The heavily synthesized corn, possessing shallow root systems entirely dependent on regular rainfall and surface-level chemical feeding, was burning alive. The stalks were brittle, snapping in the hot, dry winds. The leaves were entirely brown and shredded, offering no canopy to protect the baked earth below. Harlan had poured $750,000 into synthetic fertilizers and herbicides, and he was staring down a total, unmitigated crop failure. Abigail Thornton's farm, conversely, had become a bizarre, vibrant oasis. The white Dutch clover had formed a dense, protective mat that completely shaded the topsoil. While the ambient air temperature hovered around a blistering 102 degrees, the soil temperature beneath Abigail's clover canopy was a cool, moist 75. The deep-diving roots of the clover were pulling up subterranean moisture, sharing it with the corn through the vast, invisible network of mycorrhizal fungi. Abigail's corn was deep green, standing 8 feet tall, and throwing out massive, healthy ears. The contrast was not just visible, it was a loud, undeniable indictment of Harlan's entire way of life, and Harlan, facing ruin and public humiliation, was rapidly running out of patience and sanity. It happened on a moonless Tuesday night. Abigail was sleeping fitfully on the living room sofa, the windows thrown open to catch whatever meager breeze might pass through the sweltering valley. Around 2 in the morning, a low mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the distant rumble of a highway semi-truck. It was the distinct, heavy thrum of a high-clearance agricultural sprayer. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. The sound was coming from the western property line, the 3-mile stretch of wire fence that separated her farm from Harlan's. Abigail walked to the screen door. As she pushed it open, the night breeze hit her face. It carried a sharp, acrid scent. It smelled like sour plastic and burnt copper. It was a smell every farmer knew intimately: dicamba. A heavy, sickening dread pooled in her stomach. Dicamba was a highly volatile herbicide, used to burn down broadleaf weeds. White Dutch clover was a broadleaf. She grabbed her keys, sprinted to her rusted pickup truck, and tore down the dirt lane, the headlights cutting wildly through the dark. By the time she reached the western ridge, the sound of the diesel engine was fading into the distance. Harlan's massive 90-foot boom sprayer was a dark silhouette retreating across his barren fields, its running lights turned off like a thief in the night. Abigail parked the truck and stepped out into the darkness. She couldn't see the damage yet, but she could feel the chemical mist settling on her skin, burning her eyes. When the sun rose a few hours later, the devastation was agonizingly clear. A swath of her field, roughly 50 yards wide and running the entire 3-mile length of the property line, was dying. The dicamba had drifted across the fence on the night wind. The vibrant, life-saving clover was already curling at the edges, turning a sickly, radioactive yellow. Deprived of its living mulch, the exposed soil was instantly subjected to the brutal morning sun. The cornstalks in the drift zone, hit by the chemical and suddenly stripped of their fungal support system, were drooping heavily. Abigail drove straight to Harlan's compound. She didn't knock. She marched past his bewildered farmhands, pushed open the door to his air-conditioned office, and slammed her palms onto his mahogany desk. Harlan was sitting back in his leather chair, a mug of coffee in his hand, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose farm was bankrupting itself. "You sprayed the fence line in a temperature inversion," Abigail said, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt cold. "You intentionally drifted dicamba over 50 acres of my crop." Harlan took a slow sip of his coffee. "Morning to you too, Abby. And I have no idea what you're talking about. We were doing a routine late-season burn down on some resistant water hemp. If some of the product volatilized and drifted on the breeze, well, that's just an act of God. It's a known risk with these modern chemicals. Read the label." "There wasn't any weed pressure on that fence line, Harlan. Your fields are dead," Abigail shouted. "You tried to murder my crop because you can't stand the fact that an uneducated girl with dead dirt is about to out-yield the king of Oakhaven Valley by 50 bushels an acre." Harlan's relaxed facade cracked, a flash of genuine venom darkening his eyes. He leaned forward, planting his massive forearms on the desk. "You listen to me. Your little science experiment is an insult to every man in this county who broke his back doing things the right way. You're harboring a noxious weed. The drift was an accident. Good luck proving otherwise to the State Agricultural Board. And good luck paying off First Horizon Bank when a quarter of your yield is burned to a crisp." Abigail stared at him, the realization setting in. Harlan knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't just about pride anymore. If Abigail failed to make her balloon payment in November, the bank would foreclose, the land would go to public auction, and Harlan, despite his current losses, had enough equity and political pull with the local bank to buy her acreage for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just trying to save face, he was orchestrating a hostile takeover. "You're going to regret this, Harlan," she whispered, backing away toward the door. "I doubt it," he replied coldly. "I've already called Clayton Price. As a concerned neighbor, I felt it was my duty to inform the bank that your uninsurable crop has suffered massive chemical damage. Expect a visit." Harlan's threat materialized exactly 48 hours later. Clayton Price's silver sedan navigated the deeply rutted dirt road leading to Abigail's farmhouse, kicking up a plume of dust that coated the dying weeds by the ditch. When Clayton stepped out, he wasn't wearing his usual crisp gray suit. He wore a heavy frown and carried a thick, intimidating legal binder. Abigail met him on the porch, refusing to invite him inside. "Ms. Thornton," Clayton began, his tone stripped of any residual professional courtesy. "The bank has been made aware of a significant incident regarding your collateral. Reports indicate that a substantial portion of your cash crop has suffered irreversible chemical burn." "It was an illegal pesticide drift," Abigail shot back. "Harlan Mitchell sprayed dicamba in the middle of the night during a temperature inversion. I've filed a report with the Environmental Protection Agency." "The EPA's investigative backlog is currently 18 months, Clayton replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "First Horizon Bank does not operate on a bureaucratic timeline. Furthermore, because you utilized an unapproved, unverified planting method, interseeding a known broadleaf weed, the federal crop insurance adjuster has officially denied your claim. You have zero financial safety net." Clayton opened the binder, pulling out a freshly printed document with a bold red header. "This is a notice of accelerated default," Clayton stated, handing her the paper. "Because the value of the crop has been compromised, the bank's collateral is no longer secure. We are moving the deadline. You have exactly 30 days to liquidate assets and cover the entirety of the $300,000 operating note, or we seize the property and all agricultural equipment." Abigail took the paper, her hands trembling. 30 days. It was mid-August. The corn wouldn't even be ready for harvest until late October. The bank was legally suffocating her before the crop could even reach the grain elevator. "You can't do this, Clayton. The core of the field is fine. The clover is holding the water. I'm going to have a record harvest on the remaining 250 acres. We deal in verified projections, Abigail, not dirt farming fantasies," Clayton said, turning back toward his car. 30 days. I highly suggest you call Mr. Mitchell. I believe his offer to buy the land privately is still on the table. It's the only way you walk away without declaring bankruptcy." As Clayton drove away, Abigail sank onto the porch steps, the notice of default fluttering in the hot wind. She was trapped in a perfectly executed legal and financial vice. Harlan and the bank had cornered her. The local co-op wouldn't help her, the insurance wouldn't cover her, and the county officials were all drinking Harlan's chemically tainted Kool-Aid. She needed a weapon. She needed an authority that superseded the corrupt ecosystem of Oakhaven Valley. She ran into the house, pulled open her laptop, and frantically scrolled through her browser history until she found the academic paper that had started it all. She found the email address for Dr. Harrison Mead, the lead soil microbiologist at the State Agricultural University located 400 miles away. She didn't write a polite inquiry. She wrote a desperate, data-driven plea. She detailed the exact planting depths, the rapid nodulation of the clover, the sudden survival of her corn in a historic drought, and finally the deliberate chemical sabotage by her neighbor. She attached photos of the deep, dark, fungal-rich soil beneath her canopy, contrasted with the bleached, cracked earth of Harlan's multi-million-dollar failure. She hit send, praying to a god of dirt and rain. 2 agonizing days passed in total silence. Abigail spent them walking the fields, mourning the 50 acres of chemically burned corn on the western edge, and fiercely guarding the thriving, vibrant jungle that remained. On the 3rd morning, a rusted, battered Subaru Outback, covered in bumper stickers, came rattling up her driveway. A man stepped out who looked less like a scientist and more like a crazed, exhausted prospector. Dr. Harrison Mead was in his late 50s, possessing wild, graying hair, a permanent sunburn, and eyes that burned with a manic, obsessive intelligence. He was wearing cargo shorts and carrying a massive stainless steel soil auger. "You Abigail?" he barked, not bothering with introductions as he marched toward the porch. "Yes, Dr. Mead." "Your email," Mead said, pointing a dirt-stained finger at her. "The nodulation photos, the root exudate structure. Tell me you didn't digitally alter those pictures." "I didn't," Abigail said, a spark of hope finally igniting in her chest. "Good," Mead grunted, tossing a heavy pelican case onto the dusty ground. "Because the academic board at the university has been laughing at my regenerative theories for 5 years. They say it only works in a greenhouse. They say it doesn't scale to commercial acreage. If what you have out there is real, Miss Thornton, you haven't just saved your farm. You've created the holy grail of drought-resistant agriculture." Abigail led Mead into the blistering heat of the fields. For the next 6 hours, Mead was a whirlwind of frantic scientific activity. He drove his core auger deep into the earth, pulling up yard-long cylinders of soil. He set up a portable microscope on the tailgate of his Subaru, muttering rapidly to himself as he stained slides and examined root hairs. He started at the burned edge, the sabotage zone. "Fascinating," Mead whispered, peering through the lens. The dicamba killed the clover canopy. Without the shade, the soil temperature spiked to 110 degrees within hours. The heat sterilized the top 2 inches, killing the mycorrhizal network. The corn didn't die from the chemical, Abigail. It died from sudden, catastrophic shock. The life support system was unplugged. Then, they moved to the center of her field, into the thick, wild, messy jungle of living clover and towering corn. Mead drove his shovel into the earth and pried up a massive, dripping clump of soil. The contrast to the dead zone was breathtaking. The earth was a deep, rich black. It was practically vibrating with life. Mead gently pulled apart the roots, exposing thousands of bright, blood-red nitrogen nodules. Suddenly, Mead dropped to his knees, his eyes wide with absolute awe. "Look at this," he breathed, pointing a trembling finger at the dirt. Abigail leaned in. Moving sluggishly through the cool, damp earth was a thick, pale pink earthworm. "It hasn't rained in 50 days, Mead said, his voice thick with emotion. "The ambient temperature is 104. Every conventional field in this county is ecologically dead, and you have active breeding Lumbricus terrestris in the topsoil." He stood up, wiping his hands on his shorts, a fierce, predatory grin spreading across his face. "The bank wants verified projections?" Mead asked, looking at the towering stalks of green corn swaying against the cloudless, brutal sky. "I am the foremost soil ecologist in this state. I'm going to write a certified, legally binding yield projection based on this soil biology. Not only are you going to hit your mark, Abigail, you are going to break the county record. This soil is hyper-accumulating water." Mead walked back to his Subaru and pulled a thick sheaf of official university letterhead from a folder. "But we need to move fast," Mead warned, his tone turning deadly serious as he began writing furiously on the hood of his car. "When Harlan Mitchell realizes that his sabotage didn't destroy you, but actually provided the perfect scientific control group to prove your method works, he is going to stop playing legal games. Men like him don't know how to lose." Abigail looked out over the green expanse of her survival. She had the science. She was about to have the legal paperwork to stop the bank. But as she watched a thick, dark cloud of dust rise from Harlan's compound in the distance, she knew the real war was just beginning. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was a brick monolith that usually dealt with minor traffic citations and property line disputes. But on the second Tuesday of September, the air conditioning was failing against the crush of bodies packed into the zoning commission's hearing room. It seemed every farmer, lender, and local politician in a 50-mile radius had crammed into the wooden pews to watch the public execution of Abigail Thornton's farm. Harlan Mitchell sat in the front row, wearing a tailored navy suit that looked entirely out of place on his heavy, sun-baked frame. Beside him sat Clayton Price, his silver briefcase resting squarely on his knees. They looked less like concerned citizens and more like a corporate firing squad. Abigail sat on the opposite side of the aisle, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore her only good dress, but her hands were still deeply stained with the black earth of her fields. Next to her, Dr. Harrison Mead was aggressively organizing a mountain of manila folders, his wild hair standing on end, muttering under his breath as he reviewed his lab results. Commissioner Thomas Jenkins banged his wooden gavel, the the sound echoing sharply over the low hum of gossip. "This emergency session of the Oakhaven Agricultural Zoning Board is now in order," Jenkins announced, adjusting his microphone. "We are here to address a formal petition filed by Mr. Harlan Mitchell, representing the Valley's Growers Association, requesting an immediate county injunction against the Thornton property for harboring an unmanaged noxious weed crisis that threatens adjacent commercial agriculture." Harlan's attorney, a slick, fast-talking man from the city, stood up immediately. For 20 minutes, he painted a picture of apocalyptic negligence. He used words like blight, reckless endangerment, and economic sabotage. He projected drone photographs of Abigail's property, a wild, messy sea of green clover wrapping around the cornstalks, starkly contrasting with the neat, barren, dying rows of Harlan's chemically scorched earth. "The bank has already issued a notice of accelerated default," the attorney concluded smoothly. "Miss Thornton's crop is uninsurable and chemically compromised. We ask the county to mandate the immediate plowing under of this biological hazard before it goes to seed and destroys the remaining integrity of Oakhaven Valley." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of conventional farmers. They were scared of the drought, scared of bankruptcy, and Abigail was an easy scapegoat for their collective terror. Commissioner Jenkins looked down at Abigail. "Miss Thornton, you represent yourself. Do you have a response?" Abigail stood. Her knees felt weak, but the fire in her chest was burning hot. "I am not harboring weeds, Commissioner. I am implementing a regenerative agricultural system based on the proven protocols of real-world pioneers like Gabe Brown and the Soil Health Academy, founded by Ray Archuleta, and I have an expert witness to testify to the ecological and financial viability of my crop." Jenkins frowned. "An expert?" Dr. Meade shot up from his chair, grabbing a thick stack of glossy reports. He didn't wait to be sworn in. He practically sprinted to the podium. "I am Dr. Harrison Meade, lead soil microbiologist at the State Agricultural University. And with all due respect to the esteemed attorney, everything he just said is a scientific absurdity." The room went dead silent. Harlan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Let's talk about data," Meade barked, slapping his first report onto the projector. A massive, high-definition microscopic image of Abigail's soil filled the screen. "This is a cross-section of the Thornton topsoil. The noxious weed in question is Trifolium repens, operating in a highly symbiotic relationship with the primary cash crop. Notice the density of the rhizobium nodules. This soil is actively fixing 60 pounds of atmospheric nitrogen per acre, without a single drop of synthetic fertilizer. Miss Thornton's corn is receiving optimum nutrient uptake." Meade swapped the slide. A line graph appeared. "This is the volumetric water content of the soil. Despite 52 days without a measurable rainfall, the Thornton property retains a moisture level of 28% at a depth of 6 inches. Why? Because the living root exudates have fed a mycorrhizal fungal network that acts as a subterranean sponge. The clover canopy has dropped the surface temperature by 30 degrees, effectively halting evaporation." Meade paused, turning his piercing gaze directly onto Harlan Mitchell. "Now," Meade said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register, "let's talk about the alleged chemical compromise. I have personally analyzed the 50-acre dead zone on the western edge of the Thornton property." He threw a third slide onto the screen. It was a chemical spectrometry graph, bright red lines spiking off the charts. "This is a massive concentration of dicamba," Meade stated loudly, the words ringing off the walls. "Found exactly on the property line. Dicamba does not spontaneously generate. It was introduced into the ecosystem during a nighttime temperature inversion, an environment explicitly prohibited by the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This wasn't accidental drift. This was a deliberate, illegal application of a restricted chemical." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Clayton Price physically recoiled, inching his chair away from Harlan. "But here is the beautiful irony," Meade continued, a manic smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Mitchell's illegal sabotage provided the perfect scientific control group. By killing the clover on the edge of the property, he instantly stripped the soil of its armor. The corn in the drift zone died within 48 hours, not from the chemical, but from sudden, catastrophic drought shock, the exact same shock that is currently destroying Mr. Mitchell's 5,000 acres. Meade grabbed the microphone, leaning over the podium. Miss Thornton's crop is not a hazard. It is a miracle. Based on my certified university projections, her interior acreage will not only survive this drought, it is currently tracking to yield over 200 bushels an acre. She will outproduce every single farm in this county. If you force her to plow that field, you are not saving agriculture. You are murdering its future. Meade stepped away from the podium, his breathing heavy in the quiet room. Commissioner Jenkins stared at the data on the screen, then looked over at Harlan Mitchell. Harlan's face was the color of wet ash. He was staring straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the other farmers, who were now whispering furiously among themselves. The EPA violation alone could bankrupt him in federal fines. In light of this new scientific evidence, Commissioner Jenkins stammered, banging his gavel weakly, the petition for an injunction is denied. Furthermore, a copy of this transcript will be forwarded to the State Department of Agriculture for environmental review regarding the pesticide drift. Abigail let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 months. She had won the battle in the courtroom, but outside, the sky was turning a sickly, bruised purple. The earth was about to deliver the final verdict. Nature possesses a wicked sense of irony. It starves the land of water until the soil cracks, and then it delivers the relief with a violence that shatters whatever is left. In the final week of September, the high-pressure dome that had baked Oakhaven Valley all summer finally collapsed. It didn't usher in gentle autumn showers. It unleashed a massive, swirling derecho, a line of severe thunderstorms packing 60-mile-per-hour winds and a deluge of atmospheric moisture. Abigail stood on her porch, as the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The air smelled sharply of ozone and pulverized dust. When the rain hit, it didn't fall in drops. It fell in solid, suffocating sheets. Over 5 inches of rain fell in less than 3 hours. For the conventional farmers of the valley, the rain was the final nail in the coffin. Modern synthetic farming leaves the soil completely naked between the widely spaced rows of crops. Without any organic matter to hold the soil together, the dirt essentially behaves like concrete. On Harlan's side of the fence, the disaster was catastrophic. The baked, dead topsoil couldn't absorb the massive influx of water. It pooled on the surface for a few minutes before gravity took over. Millions of gallons of water mixed with residual chemical fertilizers turned into a raging, toxic mudslide. It ripped through his barren fields, tearing the withered, shallow-rooted cornstalks completely out of the ground. Decades of expensive, irreplaceable topsoil washed into the county ditches, turning the local creeks a sickly, chemical brown. But on Abigail's farm, the microscopic army she had cultivated went to work. The heavy, punishing raindrops never hit the bare earth. They struck the dense, tangled canopy of the white Dutch clover. The impact was shattered, the water trickling gently down the green leaves to the soil below. Beneath the surface, the intricate, sprawling web of mycorrhizal fungi and deeply penetrating clover roots acted as a massive biological sponge. The water didn't run off, it infiltrated. It sank deep into the dark, porous, living earth, locking away millions of gallons of moisture into the subsoil, securing the massive root structures of Abigail's towering corn. While Harlan's farm washed away, Abigail's farm simply drank. 3 weeks later, the skies were a crisp, brilliant blue, and the air held the sharp, cold bite of late October. It was harvest day. Abigail sat in the high cab of her late father's ancient rattling John Deere 9500 combine. She had spent the last 2 days welding rusted augers and greasing the worn bearings, praying the old green machine would hold together for just one more pass. As she engaged the separator and drove the massive header into the first row of corn, the sound of the stalks being pulled into the machine was deafening, but it was a beautiful noise. The corn was incredibly dry, the stalks thick and heavy. She glanced down at the aftermarket yield monitor she had installed on the console. It took a few seconds for the sensors to calibrate the incoming flow of grain. The digital numbers flickered, then stabilized. 212 bushels per acre. Abigail hit the brakes. The massive machine shuddered to a halt in the middle of the field. She stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The county average during a good year with perfect rain and maximum chemical input, was 180 bushels an acre. In this year of historic drought, the conventional farmers who hadn't been washed away in the flood were pulling barely 40. She put the combine back in gear. She ran row after row, driving deep into the night, the powerful headlights cutting a swathe through the dense, towering jungle of corn and clover. The yield never dropped. The old John Deere's grain tank filled so fast she had to call Dale Garrison at the local co-op to beg for extra grain carts. When the final tally was calculated at the county grain elevator, the numbers sent shockwaves through the entire agricultural community of the state. Abigail Thornton had harvested 214 bushels an acre across 250 acres. Because of the widespread drought, the commodity price of corn had skyrocketed. She hadn't just survived, she had struck gold. On a quiet Tuesday morning in November, 2 days before the bank's absolute deadline, Abigail walked through the heavy glass doors of First Horizon Bank. She didn't wear a dress this time. She wore her dusty work boots, her faded jeans, and a jacket that smelled faintly of diesel smoke and sweet corn. She bypassed the tellers and walked directly into Clayton Price's corner office. Clayton looked up from his computer, his face tightening instantly. "Abigail, I told you there are no more extensions. The paperwork for the asset seizure is already on my desk." Abigail didn't say a word. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a certified cashier's check from the Oak Haven Agricultural Co-op. She dropped it squarely in the center of Clayton's immaculate desk. Clayton picked up the slip of paper, adjusting his glasses. He stared at the numbers. He blinked, pulled his glasses off, cleaned them with a silk handkerchief, put them back on, and stared at the check again. It was made out for $480,000. Clayton choked, his voice cracking. "This is impossible. The drought, the chemical damage took 50 acres, Abigail said quietly, leaning over the desk so Clayton was forced to look her in the eye. "The living soil saved the rest. That check covers the operating loan, the balloon payment on the mortgage, and the early payoff penalties. The Thornton farm is completely free and clear." Clayton sat frozen, holding the check as if it were radioactive. "Harlan Mitchell filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy this morning," he whispered, almost to himself. "The EPA fines for the dicamba drift, the total crop loss. The bank is seizing his equipment tomorrow. You can tell Harlan something for me when you see him," Abigail said, turning toward the door. "What's that?" Clayton asked weakly. Abigail smiled, a hard, earned expression that held all the weight of the summer's agonizing labor. "Tell him the dead dirt says hello." The winter that followed Abigail's record-breaking harvest was the quietest Oak Haven Valley had been in a century. The massive, roaring diesel engines of Harlan Mitchell's fleet were gone, auctioned off to the highest bidders in neighboring counties. His sprawling, sterile 5,000 acres sat dormant beneath a thick blanket of January snow, a silent monument to the spectacular collapse of conventional agricultural dogma. Abigail spent the winter resting, her bank accounts finally black, her family's legacy secured. But the quiet was deceptive. While the valley slept, a different kind of storm was gathering force, born not of atmospheric pressure, but of corporate panic. In late February, Dr. Harrison Mead published a peer-reviewed 40-page thesis in the Global Journal of Soil Ecology. He titled it The Thornton Anomaly, Subterranean Nitrogen Fixation and Drought Immunity in Commercial Monocultures. The paper went viral. It wasn't just read by academics. It was shared in Facebook groups by desperate, debt-ridden farmers across the Midwest. Podcasts discussed it. Independent agricultural magazines put Abigail's dust-streaked face on their covers. The message was clear, and it was terrifying to the establishment. You do not need to buy synthetic nitrogen to survive. The earth can do it for free. For the multi-billion-dollar agrochemical conglomerates that controlled the global fertilizer and seed markets, Abigail Thornton had just transformed from a local nuisance into a systemic existential threat. If 10% of the American Corn Belt adopted her white clover method, the chemical companies would lose billions in annual revenue. They could not allow the Thornton anomaly to become the new standard. The counterattack began on a slushy Tuesday morning in March. Abigail was in her barn, rebuilding the transmission on her father's old tractor, when a sleek black Lincoln Navigator rolled up her driveway. The man who stepped out did not look like a farmer, a banker, or a local politician. He wore a tailored charcoal topcoat, Italian leather gloves, and an expression of polished, predatory calm. "Miss Thornton," the man said, stepping delicately around a puddle of melting snow. "My name is Preston Gallagher. I represent Apex Agrisciences. Abigail set her wrench down, wiping the grease from her hands with a rag. Apex Agrisciences was the third largest producer of synthetic fertilizers and genetically modified seed in the hemisphere. They were the company that had sold Harlan Mitchell the chemicals that had ultimately bankrupted him. "You're a long way from Chicago, Mr. Gallagher," Abigail said, her guard instantly up. "I don't buy your seed, and I certainly don't buy your fertilizer. We have nothing to discuss." "On the contrary, we have 5,000 acres to discuss," Preston replied, offering a thin, perfectly practiced smile. Apex Agrisciences finalized the purchase of the foreclosed Mitchell estate yesterday morning. "We are your new neighbors." A cold spike of dread pierced Abigail's chest. Harlan had been a bully, but he was just a man. Apex was an empire. "We are turning the Mitchell property into a premier research and development facility," Preston continued, pulling a pristine manila envelope from his coat. "And we are highly intrigued by the localized phenomena you experienced last season. Apex is willing to offer you $7 million for your 500 acres. Cash. We will close by Friday." $7 million. It was an astronomical sum, easily quadruple the market value of the land. It was enough money to walk away forever, to live in absolute luxury and never worry about drought, debt, or dirt ever again. "And the catch?" Abigail asked, her eyes narrowing. "Standard corporate procedure," Preston said smoothly. "The sale comes with a strict, lifetime non-disclosure agreement. You hand over the land, you hand over Dr. Mead's raw data, and you agree to cease all public interviews regarding your farming methodologies. You take the money and you disappear." They weren't buying her farm. They were burying the cure. They wanted to pave over the living soil, lock the data in a corporate vault, and ensure the farmers of the world remained utterly dependent on Apex's synthetic, chemical drip feed. "My family bled into this soil, Mr. Gallagher," Abigail said, her voice steady and hard. "It's not a laboratory, and it's not a secret to be swept under the rug. Tell your board of directors my farm is not for sale." Preston Gallagher's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. He didn't seem surprised. He simply shifted to his backup plan. He opened the envelope and pulled out a thick legal document stamped with a federal court seal. "I assumed you would let sentimentality cloud your business judgment," Preston said, handing her the papers. "This is a cease and desist order, accompanied by a federal lawsuit for intellectual property theft and patent infringement." "Patent infringement?" Abigail practically laughed. "I haven't used a patented product in my life. I plant heritage seed." "You planted heritage seed?" Preston corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But corn is wind-pollinated, Miss Thornton. Harlan Mitchell planted Apex's proprietary, genetically modified, drought-shield corn directly adjacent to your property. Our agronomists have already taken samples from the grain you stored at the county elevator. Your record-breaking crop contains trace markers of our patented genetics." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "By the strict letter of federal law," Preston said, "you grew our patented technology without a licensing agreement. Apex owns your harvest. We own the rights to the progeny of that seed, and we will bury you in so much federal litigation that your grandchildren will be paying off our legal fees. You have 48 hours to reconsider the $7 million. After that, we take the land for free." Preston turned, walked back to his navigator, and drove away, leaving Abigail standing in the freezing barn, holding a piece of paper that had the power to destroy everything she had just rebuilt. For 3 days, Abigail didn't sleep. The legal paperwork Preston Gallagher had served her was a masterpiece of corporate strangulation. The precedent was terrifyingly real. Multi-billion-dollar seed companies routinely sued small farmers for accidental cross-pollination and won, citing strict patent laws. If Abigail fought them in a traditional courtroom, Apex's army of lawyers would stall the proceedings for years, bleeding her dry until she was forced to liquidate the farm just to pay her defense attorneys. She needed a miracle, and she needed it outside the confines of a rigged legal system. She called Dr. Harrison Mead. The scientist arrived from the university 6 hours later, looking even more disheveled than usual. When she explained the lawsuit, Mead didn't panic. Instead, a strange feral glint appeared in his eyes. "They played their hand too early," Mead muttered, pacing rapidly across Abigail's kitchen floor. "They are assuming your record yields were a result of their accidental genetic drift. They are claiming their drought shield trait is what saved your crop." "Isn't it?" Abigail asked, panic edging into her voice. "If the pollen drifted, Pollen drifts, yes, Mead snapped, grabbing his laptop. But biology is infinitely more complex than a corporate patent. I didn't just test your soil last summer, Abigail. I took tissue samples of your corn. I ran full genetic sequencing to understand how the plant was interacting with the clover's nitrogen. I still have the frozen samples. Mead looked up, his grin terrifying and brilliant. We aren't going to fight them in federal court. We are going to fight them in the daylight. 2 weeks later, the snow began to thaw, turning the dirt roads of Oakhaven Valley into thick, heavy mud. But the mud didn't stop the convoy of pickup trucks. Abigail had spent every dollar she had left from the harvest to organize an event she called the Living Soil Summit. She bypassed the corporate agricultural media and reached out directly to independent farming networks, podcasters, and local growers. She invited anyone who was drowning in debt and tired of fighting dead dirt. Over 400 farmers from 6 different states descended upon the Thornton farm. They parked in the pastures, set up folding chairs in the massive barn, and waited. Just as Abigail stepped up to the makeshift plywood stage, a pair of black SUVs tore up the driveway, lights flashing. Preston Gallagher stepped out, accompanied by the county sheriff and 2 grim-faced corporate attorneys. "Shut it down!" Preston barked, marching through the crowd of bewildered farmers. He pointed a finger at Abigail. "Miss Thornton, you are in direct violation of a pending federal injunction. You do not have the right to broadcast proprietary agricultural data," the crowd murmured, a wave of tension rippling through the barn. Local farmers recognized the corporate heavy-handedness. Many of them had lived in fear of it their entire lives. "Let him speak," Dr. Mead's booming voice echoed from the back of the stage. The scientist stepped out from behind a projector screen, holding a thick binder of lab results. "Mr. Gallagher claims that Miss Thornton's success is the intellectual property of Apex Agri-Sciences," Mead announced to the silent, watchful crowd. "He claims his patented drought shield genetics drifted into her field and saved her crop." Mead pressed a button, and a massive, complex genetic sequence appeared on the projector screen. "I sent tissue samples of Miss Thornton's corn to an independent international genetic laboratory in Switzerland," Mead said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The results arrived yesterday. Yes, there was cross-pollination. Trace amounts of Apex's patented DNA were found in her crop." Preston Gallagher smiled a cold, victorious smile. "As I said, patent infringement. Sheriff, please clear this property." "Wait!" Mead roared, slamming his fist onto the podium. "You didn't let me finish the biology lesson, Preston. The Swiss lab didn't just find your genetics. They mapped the epigenetic expression of the plant." Mead switched the slide to a side-by-side comparison. Apex's drought shield gene is designed to trigger a stress response in the plant, forcing it to conserve water in dead, sterile soil, Mead explained to the crowd. But Miss Thornton's soil wasn't dead. It was hyper-alive. The mycorrhizal fungal network she built with the clover was pushing so much water, nitrogen, and complex hormones into the corn that the plant experienced zero stress. Mead turned to face Gallagher, his expression triumphant. "The plant never activated your patented gene. The epigenetic markers prove that your drought shield trait remained completely dormant. It was genetically silenced by the sheer health of the soil. Your technology didn't save her farm, Mr. Gallagher. The living dirt suffocated your technology." The barn erupted. 400 farmers began shouting, cheering, and stomping their boots on the wooden floorboards. The noise was deafening. It was the sound of a century-old corporate monopoly shattering. Preston Gallagher stood frozen, his face pale, surrounded by hundreds of rugged men and women who were suddenly realizing that the chains of their chemical debts were completely imaginary. If Apex sued Abigail now, Mead's data would become public record in a federal court, proving to the entire world that a $5 bag of clover seed was vastly superior to a billion-dollar genetic patent. Apex's stock would plummet overnight. Gallagher looked at the sheriff, who simply shrugged, stepping back into the crowd. Without a word, the corporate fixer turned on his heel, pushed his way through the cheering farmers, and practically ran back to his SUV. Abigail stepped up to the microphone, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, men like Dale Garrison and even a few of Harlan Mitchell's former farmhands, who were looking at her not as a crazy girl, but as a pioneer. "We've spent our whole lives fighting the earth," Abigail said, her voice trembling but carrying clear across the barn. "We poisoned it, we baked it, and we let corporations sell us the bandages for the wounds they created. But the dirt isn't dead. It's just waiting for us to let it breathe. That spring, the landscape of Oakhaven Valley began to change. Tractors rolled out across the fields, but they weren't pulling heavy chemical sprayers. They were pulling seed drills, dropping millions of tiny white clover seeds into the earth. The harsh, sterile brown of the county gave way to a soft, vibrant, unbreakable green. Abigail Thornton didn't just save her farm, she woke up the world, proving that the greatest technology humanity will ever wield is the quiet, ancient magic waiting just beneath our boots. They told Abigail her farm was dead. They told her the dirt was useless, the debt was insurmountable, and her only option was to surrender to the corporate chemical machine. But Abigail knew something the billion-dollar industries didn't. Nature always finds a way if you have the courage to step back and let her work. Her fight wasn't just about saving a piece of land. It was about exposing a broken system and proving that the future of our planet lies in healing the soil, not poisoning it. If Abigail's incredible defiance inspired you, please hit that like button. It shows the algorithm that real, empowering stories still matter. Share this video with anyone who loves an underdog fighting the system. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into the hidden true stories that are changing the world. Keep digging for the truth, and we'll see you in the next one.